In the sterile waiting room of Millbrook Heights Medical Center, a 52-year-old widow was about to discover her daughter's devastating betrayal. What started as a routine doctor's appointment took a shocking turn when she overheard a calculated conspiracy. Sarah Williams wasn't your typical grieving mother. For 2 decades, she had served as a registered nurse, known for her sharp medical instincts. When she secretly recorded Emma instructing Dr. Reid to tell her she's going crazy, she uncovered a web of medical gaslighting designed to steal her inheritance. What started as supposed family concern would become a fight against institutional corruption that would forever change Millbrook Heights. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Delacroix estate rose from the Hamptons coastline like a monument to old money certainty, its limestone facade catching the late afternoon sun with the same practiced elegance that had intimidated visitors for 3 generations. Hershey Delacroix sat in her rented Honda Civic at the edge of the circular drive, studying the mansion through her windshield with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned to read hostile territory. She'd dressed for this meeting the way a soldier chose camouflage, calculated to blend into expectations. The off-the-rack blazer from Target hung slightly loose on her frame, the kind of garment that whispered financial struggle to people who measured worth by designer labels. Her laptop bag bore the subtle scuffs of someone who couldn't afford to replace functional items, though the technology inside could have funded a small country. Just another performance, she murmured to herself, checking her reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back had mastered the art of appearing defeated while hiding an empire. The mansion's marble foyer echoed her footsteps with the hollow sound of spaces designed to dwarf visitors. Oil paintings of stern-faced Delacroix ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to track her movement with centuries of accumulated judgment. She'd memorized those faces as a child, dreaming of someday earning a place among them. Now she wondered if they were worth the wall space they occupied. "Hershey, darling," Catherine Delacroix Ashworth emerged from the morning room with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent decades perfecting her entrance. At 52, Catherine possessed the kind of polished beauty that spoke of personal trainers, nutritionists, and cosmetic procedures administered with surgical precision. Her smile carried all the warmth of a tax audit. "Aunt Catherine." Hershey accepted the air kisses with practiced resignation, noting how Catherine's eyes performed their usual inventory, taking in the budget clothing, the lack of jewelry, the carefully cultivated appearance of someone perpetually one step away from financial disaster. "You look," Catherine paused, her smile sharpening. "Well, you look like you're managing. How are the latest ventures progressing?" The question carried enough poisoned sympathy to kill a small mammal. Hershey had learned to navigate Catherine's conversational minefields with the same careful precision she applied to billion-dollar business decisions. "Still exploring opportunities," Hershey replied, letting a note of defensive uncertainty creep into her voice. "The market's been challenging." "Of course it has, dear." Catherine's tone suggested she was discussing a child's unsuccessful lemonade stand. "Entrepreneurship is so unpredictable. Perhaps we should discuss more stable arrangements during today's meeting." They moved through the mansion's formal rooms toward the family boardroom, passing through spaces that could have housed entire families, but instead showcased the Delacroix commitment to displaying wealth with museum-quality precision. Eleanor Delacroix held court in the library's lever backwing chair, her 76 years carried with the ramrod posture of someone who'd built an empire through sheer force of will. "Hershey, grandmother," she bent to kiss Eleanor's cheek, catching the familiar scent of Chanel No. 5 and the subtle medicinal undertones that spoke of recent health concerns. Eleanor's eyes held the sharp assessment that once evaluated textile markets and real estate opportunities across 3 decades. Despite her age, those eyes missed nothing, though Hershey had learned to present them with carefully curated information. "Hershey, child, still chasing those technology dreams, I assume?" The dismissal stung precisely because it came wrapped in genuine affection. Eleanor loved her granddaughter with the complicated devotion of someone who couldn't understand why intelligence manifested as stubbornness rather than conformity. James Delacroix III stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghost-like against the ocean view. At 31, he carried the burden of family expectations with the visible strain of someone perpetually measuring himself against impossible standards. His suit cost more than most people's monthly rent, but couldn't disguise the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of someone who medicated anxiety with premium alcohol. Hershey. His greeting carried genuine warmth despite the formal setting. Of all her family members, James alone seemed to remember that she was a person rather than a problem to be solved. Victoria Delacroix Sterling perched on the room's antique settee with the careful positioning of someone who'd learned to display herself like valuable art. Her husband Robert stood behind her chair with the attentive posture of someone who'd married into wealth and never forgotten the precarious nature of his position. The family boardroom had witnessed 3 generations of Delacroix decisions, its mahogany table scarred by decades of contract signings and strategic planning. Today, it felt less like a place of business and more like a courtroom where Hershey was about to be tried for crimes she hadn't committed. Marcus Williams, the family attorney, arranged his documents with the precise movements of someone who understood that every paper represented millions of dollars and decades of family relationships. His discomfort was visible in the way he avoided direct eye contact, focusing instead on legal language that could sanitize the ugliest human impulses. Catherine assumed her position at the head of the table with the natural authority of someone who'd spent years positioning herself for this moment. Her opening remarks carried the formal cadence of a business presentation, with charts and financial projections that painted Hershey's entrepreneurial efforts as a catalog of expensive failures. Over the past 5 years, Catherine began, her voice carrying the conviction of someone presenting irrefutable evidence, we've documented a pattern of financial irresponsibility that threatens the stability of our family's legacy. Each example hit like a precisely aimed bullet. The startup that failed after 18 months, though its IP had been sold for 8 figures. The consulting firm that dissolved due to market pressures, while its algorithms were quietly incorporated into a Fortune 500 company. The investment portfolio that appeared catastrophically managed because its true value was hidden behind shell companies and offshore holdings. Hershey sat motionless through the systematic destruction of her reputation, her face maintaining the careful expression of someone who'd learned to absorb criticism without flinching. Inside, she calculated the devastating irony of being condemned for failures that were actually her greatest successes. James shifted uncomfortably as Catherine's presentation continued, his loyalty to family tradition warring with his instinctive knowledge that something wasn't right about this coordinated attack. His voice cracked slightly when he finally spoke. Catherine, these seem like insulated incidents. Maybe we should consider—
What we should consider, Catherine interrupted with surgical precision, is our fiduciary responsibility to protect family assets from continued mismanagement. The vote, when it came, felt as inevitable as a death sentence. Victoria's support came wrapped in apologetic smiles and concerned expressions that couldn't disguise her relief at eliminating competition. Robert's agreement carried the casual certainty of someone whose survival depended on backing winners. Even Eleanor's reluctant acquiescence felt like watching the family matriarch sign Hershey's execution order. Only James hesitated, his internal struggle playing out in real time as he weighed a lifetime of family conditioning against his genuine love for his sister. "I'm sorry, Hershey," he whispered as he cast the deciding vote. The words echoed in the suddenly silent boardroom, carrying the weight of 28 years of family relationships being severed with parliamentary efficiency. Hershey Delacroix, granddaughter, sister, failed entrepreneur, had been formally excised from the family fortune with the same clinical precision used to remove cancerous tissue. Catherine's satisfied smile suggested someone who'd successfully completed a complex surgical procedure. Around the table, family members avoided eye contact with the patient who'd just been declared terminal. But as Hershey gathered her modest belongings and prepared to leave the boardroom that had just rejected her, she felt something unexpected bubbling up from beneath her carefully maintained facade. Not despair or humiliation, but something far more dangerous. Relief. For the first time in years, she wouldn't have to pretend to be less than she was. The family that had never seen her true worth had just freed her to claim it on her own terms. The Delacroix Trust had just made the most expensive mistake in its 3-generation history. Marcus's hand had been steady during the boardroom vote, but Hershey noticed the slight tremor as he'd shuffled his papers afterward, the unconscious tell of someone who knew they'd just witnessed something fundamentally wrong. Now, 36 hours later, she stood in her true domain, where trembling hands belonged to others, where her word moved markets and her decisions shaped the future of artificial intelligence. The 42nd floor of the Meridian Technologies Tower offered a view of Manhattan that rivaled any Hamptons mansion, but Hershey barely noticed the cityscape as she moved through the sleek corridors of her empire. Here, her Target blazer had been replaced by Italian silk, her scuffed laptop bag exchanged for handcrafted leather that cost more than most people's cars. The transformation wasn't just sartorial, it was fundamental, like watching a carefully contained wildfire suddenly find oxygen. "The board's been asking questions," Nicole Chen said without preamble as Hershey entered the executive conference room. Nicole's desk setup resembled mission control more than a traditional workspace. Multiple screens displaying market data, code repositories, and real-time analytics that would have made NASA jealous. Despite being 32, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd helped build something revolutionary from nothing. "What kind of questions?" Hershey settled into her chair, noting how the familiar weight of actual decision-making felt lighter than the performance she'd maintained for her family. "The careful kind. About why MD Chen keeps declining profile interviews, about why our IPO documentation lists educational credentials that don't quite add up under scrutiny." Nicole's fingers moved across her keyboard with the fluid precision of someone who thought in code. "David Montgomery from TechCrunch has been particularly persistent." Sarah Chen looked at from her analysis of their quarterly projections, her expression carrying the focused intensity that had made her indispensable despite being the youngest person in the room. "The family trust story hit the social media feeds. Someone leaked details about you being cut out. Montgomery's connecting dots." Hershey felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd built Meridian Technologies behind layers of corporate veils and carefully constructed fiction, but investigative journalists specialized in unraveling exactly those kinds of mysteries. "Show me," she said. The wall display lit up with social media posts, financial blog entries, and fragments of speculation that painted an uncomfortably accurate picture of her situation. The story had the viral quality that modern media fed on, wealthy family dramatics combined with hints of deeper secrets. Nicole's voice carried carefully controlled concern. "We could weather a revelation. The company's strong enough now that your identity wouldn't destroy what we've built, but it would destroy the fiction that's protected me for 5 years, the careful balance that's let me build this while keeping them from interfering." Sarah pulled up another screen showing Meridian's latest valuation reports. The numbers told a story that would have made Catherine's dismissive presentation look like a financial comedy routine. Meridian Technologies had grown from Hershey's dorm room experiments into an AI powerhouse worth $12 billion, with Hershey's personal stake approaching $8 billion, which is more than triple the entire family trust. "The irony is almost perfect," Hershey said, studying the financial projections that represented years of 18-hour days and strategic decisions that her family had dismissed as childish fantasies. "They voted me out for being financially irresponsible. I could buy them out with pocket change." Nicole's expression grew more serious. "That's what worries me. You've been carrying this double identity for so long that I'm not sure you remember which version is real anymore." The observation hit harder than intended. Hershey had spent so many years calibrating her performance for family consumption that she sometimes lost track of where the performance ended and her authentic self began. In boardrooms filled with venture capitalists and tech visionaries, she commanded respect and billion-dollar decisions. In family gatherings, she diminished herself into someone apologetic and struggling. "They never saw me," she said quietly. 28 years of family dinners, trust meetings, holiday gatherings, and they never once looked at me and saw potential instead of problems. Sarah's loyalty sparked in her voice. "Their loss. But now you have a choice to make. Montgomery's getting close to the truth, and once it comes out, there's no going back to the way things were." The weight of decision pressed against Hershey's shoulders.
Revealing her success would vindicate her against every dismissive comment and condescending smile her family had ever given her. But it would also mean surrendering the independence she'd fought so hard to maintain, the freedom to build something entirely on her own, without family interference or expectation. Nicole leaned forward, her expression mixing professional concern with personal affection. "What do you want to do?" Hershey looked around the conference room that had witnessed the strategic decisions that built an empire, then back at the screens displaying her family's dismissal trending across social media platforms. Somewhere in Manhattan, an investigative journalist was connecting dots that would soon make her choice irrelevant. The performance was ending whether she chose it or not. The only question was whether she would control the narrative or let others write her story for her. David Montgomery had built his reputation by following paper trails that led to inconvenient truths, and the Delacroix family trust story carried all the hallmarks of something much larger hiding beneath the surface. His cluttered office in Lower Manhattan resembled a detective's war room more than a journalist's workspace. Whiteboards covered with financial connections, corporate filings scattered across every available surface, and multiple monitors displaying the kind of deep-dive research that separated real investigative work from surface-level reporting.
"Here's what doesn't make sense," he muttered to his research assistant Kelly, pointing at a timeline he'd constructed on the whiteboard. "Hershey Delacroix gets cut from the family trust for financial irresponsibility, but look at these SEC filings." Kelly leaned in, studying the documents Montgomery had highlighted. Shell companies? Multiple layers of them, and they all trace back to investment vehicles that were established right around the time Hershey supposedly dropped out of Harvard Business School. Montgomery's finger traced connections between corporate entities that most people would have dismissed as coincidental. Someone with serious money has been building a very sophisticated financial structure over the past 5 years. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, and Stanford alumni newsletter that mentioned Hershey Delacroix's early computer science coursework before her transfer to Harvard Business School. Montgomery had learned to pay attention to academic discontinuities, especially when they involved people who later claimed to struggle with business ventures. "Cross-reference her Stanford connections with current Silicon Valley leadership," he told Kelly. "Look for anyone who might have maintained contact." What they found was a pattern of relationships that painted a very different picture of Hershey's capabilities. Former classmates described her as brilliant but secretive, someone who understood technology at a level that impressed even Stanford's most accomplished students. Several mentioned her abrupt departure for Harvard Business School as surprising, given her obvious aptitude for technical innovation. Montgomery's next call was to Dr. Sarah Kim, one of Hershey's former professors, who now consulted for several major tech companies. "Hershey Delacroix," Dr. Kim's voice carried genuine warmth when Montgomery reached her. "Absolutely brilliant student, one of those minds that sees connections other people miss completely. I was sorry to lose her to business school, though I suppose it makes sense given her family background." "Did she stay in touch? Continue any projects after transferring?" A pause. "You know, I can't discuss specific student work, but I will say that some of the most innovative AI research I've seen in recent years reminds me very much of the conceptual framework Hershey was developing here." Montgomery's feeling the familiar electricity of a story beginning to crystallize. He spent the next 2 days diving deeper into the corporate maze surrounding Meridian Technologies, the AI startup that had seemingly emerged from nowhere to become one of the most valuable private companies in Silicon Valley. The company's official narrative claimed its founder, M.D. Chen, was a former Stanford dropout who'd built the business through pure technical innovation. But Montgomery's investigation revealed inconsistencies that any competent journalist would have caught. Educational credentials that didn't quite align with available records, a personal history that seemed carefully curated to avoid specific details, and a management structure that suggested someone was working very hard to maintain anonymity. "Look at this," Kelly said, highlighting financial documents on her screen. "Early Meridian funding came through the same investment vehicles we traced back to Hershey Delacroix's timeline." Montgomery studied the connections, feeling pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. She didn't drop out of business school to pursue failed startups. She dropped out to build Meridian Technologies. The implications were staggering.
If his suspicions were correct, Hershey Delacroix hadn't been cut from her family trust for financial irresponsibility. She'd been excluded while sitting on one of the most valuable private companies in history. The family that dismissed her as a failure had just rejected someone worth more than their entire collective fortune. But Montgomery needed proof, not just circumstantial evidence and educated speculation. He had learned from years of investigative work that corporate secrecy could be penetrated through careful analysis of public records, if you knew where to look. The breakthrough came through Meridian's recent SEC filings for their anticipated IPO. Buried in hundreds of pages of legal documentation was a single reference to secondary beneficial structural ownership that most readers would have glossed over as standard corporate language. But Montgomery recognized it as potential evidence of hidden ownership stakes. "Someone's been very careful to obscure the real ownership structure," he told Kelly as they analyzed the filings, but they had to leave breadcrumbs for regulatory compliance. His phone rang as he was cross-referencing corporate addresses. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "David Montgomery?" "Mr. Montgomery, this is Nicole Chen from Meridian Technologies. I understand you've been researching our company." Montgomery felt his pulse quicken. Companies usually didn't call journalists unless they were worried about something. "Standard background research for a potential story? Is there something specific you'd like to discuss?" "Actually, yes. I think we should meet. There are some aspects of your investigation that you might want to verify before publication." The careful phrasing told Montgomery everything he needed to know. Nicole Chen wasn't calling to deny his suspicions, she was calling to manage them, which meant his investigation had gotten close enough to make someone nervous. "I'm available this afternoon." "Actually, Mr. Montgomery, I think this conversation would be more productive if it happened in person, with all relevant parties present." Montgomery's journalistic instincts went on high alert. "All relevant parties? I believe you've been trying to identify MD Chen. Perhaps it's time for a proper introduction." After he hung up, Montgomery stared at the evidence spread across his office. Financial connections, academic records, corporate filings, and timeline correlations that painted a picture of deception so sophisticated it had fooled an entire family for years. His investigation had apparently reached the point where continuing in secret was no longer possible. Someone was ready to confirm what he suspected, but on their terms rather than his timeline. The Delacroix family trust story was about to become something much bigger, and Montgomery realized he was no longer just investigating a story, he was about to become part of it. The Delacroix estate felt different on Montgomery's second visit, though he couldn't immediately identify what had changed. The same limestone facade caught the afternoon light with practiced elegance. The same marble foyer echoed with the hollow authority of old money. But something in the atmosphere suggested a family still processing the aftershocks of decisions that had seemed so certain just days before. Catherine Delacroix Ashworth greeted him at the door with the kind of smile that suggested that she'd rather be greeting an outbreak of plague. "Mr. Montgomery, I wasn't aware we were expecting media attention." "Mrs. Ashworth, I appreciate your family making time for some follow-up questions." Montgomery had learned to present himself as respectfully persistent rather than aggressively investigative. "I understand there were some interesting developments at your recent trust meeting." "Routine family business," Catherine applied, though her tone carried the defensive edge of someone who knew that routine had become anything but. "I'm sure you understand that private family matters aren't typically subjects for journalism."
Montgomery followed her through the mansion's formal rooms, noting the subtle signs of tension that even expensive decorating couldn't disguise. Family photographs seemed strategically rearranged, as if someone had been reconsidering which relationships deserved prominent display. The library, where the family had gathered, felt like a stage set for confrontation. Eleanor Delacroix occupied her usual wingback chair with the kind of alert attention that suggested she was genuinely curious about Montgomery's presence, rather than simply tolerating it. James stood near the windows with the restless energy of someone processing uncomfortable realizations, while Victoria and Robert positioned themselves with the careful neutrality of people who'd learned to avoid taking sides until winners became clear. Hershey sat slightly apart from the others, and Montgomery noticed immediately that something fundamental had shifted in her demeanor. The apologetic uncertainty he'd observed during his initial research had been replaced by something more alert, more calculating. She watched his entrance with the kind of assessment that suggested she was evaluating him rather than preparing to be evaluated. I've been researching the connections between your family and certain Silicon Valley developments, Montgomery began, setting his recorder on the coffee table with practiced casualness. Specifically, some interesting financial relationships that seem to coincide with recent family decisions. Catherine's expression sharpened. Mr. Montgomery, I hope you're not suggesting that our private family governance has any connection to outside business interests. Actually, that's exactly what I'm suggesting. Montgomery opened his folder, spreading documentation across the coffee table with the systematic precision of someone presenting evidence. These are SEC filings for Meridian Technologies, cross-referenced with investment vehicles that trace back to this family's financial structure. The silence that followed carried enough tension to power the mansion's elaborate lighting system. Montgomery watched faces carefully, noting how different family members processed the information. Catherine's reaction suggested someone calculating damage control strategies. James looked genuinely confused, as if pieces of a puzzle were suddenly revealing a picture he'd never expected. Eleanor's sharp business mind was clearly working through implications at a speed that impressed even Montgomery. But Hershey's reaction was the most telling. She wasn't surprised by the documentation. She was evaluating how much Montgomery actually knew versus how much he was inferring. Meridian Technologies, Eleanor said slowly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that had once commanded board meetings across multiple industries. The AI company that's been making headlines for their breakthrough innovations. Among other achievements, yes, Montgomery pulled out additional documents. What makes this particularly interesting is the timeline. Meridian's founding coincides almost exactly with Hershey's departure from Harvard Business School. The company's registered address traces back to investment vehicles established around the same time. James was staring at his sister with growing amazement. Hershey, what is he talking about? I'm talking about the possibility that your family just made a very expensive mistake. Specifically, the mistake of excluding someone from your trust who may be worth significantly more than the trust itself. Catherine's composure was beginning to crack around the edges. Mr. Montgomery, I hope you're not suggesting that our private family governance has any connection to outside business interests. Actually, that's exactly what I'm suggesting. Montgomery opened his folder, spreading documentation across the coffee table with the systematic precision of someone presenting evidence. These are SEC filings for Meridian Technologies, cross-referenced with investment vehicles that trace back to this family's financial structure. The silence that followed hung in the air like a confession. Everyone in the room suddenly understood that Montgomery's presence wasn't coincidental. Someone had arranged this confrontation deliberately. Hershey stood up with movements that carried none of the apologetic uncertainty her family had grown accustomed to. When she spoke, her voice held the kind of quiet authority that made everyone else's defensive posturing seem amateur by comparison. Mr. Montgomery has been very thorough in his research, though not quite thorough enough. She moved to Eleanor's antique secretary desk and retrieved a leather portfolio that had been waiting with the kind of strategic placement that suggested careful preparation. When she opened it, the documents inside carried the official seals and letterheads that transformed speculation into verified fact. These are the complete Meridian Technologies incorporation documents, including the original founding agreements that list the primary stakeholder. Montgomery felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the moment when investigation transformed into revelation. Around the room, family members were beginning to understand that their careful assumptions about success and failure were about to be permanently shattered. Catherine's voice came out barely above a whisper. Hershey? What are you saying? I'm saying that M.D. Chen, the mysterious founder that Montgomery has been trying to identify, doesn't actually exist as a separate person. M.D. Chen is a pseudonym. My pseudonym. The words hit the room like a demolition charge, destroying years of carefully constructed family dynamics in a single explosive moment. Montgomery realized he was no longer investigating a story about family trust restructuring. He was witnessing the complete reversal of everything the Delacroix family thought they knew about success, failure, and the distribution of power within their dynasty.
James sank into the nearest chair as if his legs had suddenly forgotten how to support him. You're saying you've been running Meridian Technologies this entire time? Building, running, and preparing to take it public at a valuation that will make yesterday's trust vote look like the most expensive mistake in family history. The leather portfolio landed on the coffee table with the soft thud of a life exploding. Montgomery's trained eye immediately cataloged what he was seeing: official incorporation documents, SEC filings, and financial statements that carried the weight of legal authority rather than circumstantial speculation. But even his journalistic instinct for dramatic revelation hadn't prepared him for the systematic dismantling of reality that Hershey was about to perform. M.D. Chen, she began, her voice carrying the kind of calm precision that someone had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times. Marcus David Chen, a completely fictional identity that I created during my sophomore year at Stanford when I realized that being taken seriously in Silicon Valley required a level of anonymity that my family name would never allow. She spread the documents across the table with movements that spoke of complete confidence rather than desperate revelation. Each page carried official seals, regulatory stamps, and the kind of detailed financial information that transformed speculation into undeniable fact. Catherine's face had gone pale, though her business instincts were clearly working to process implications that her emotional state wasn't ready to accept. That's impossible. We would have known. The financial disclosures, the tax implications, would have been handled through the same investment vehicles you just saw Mr. Montgomery trace back to this family structure. Hershey's smile carried no warmth, only the satisfaction of someone finally dropping a mask she had worn for too long. Eleanor leaned forward in her wingback chair, her sharp business mind cutting through the emotional chaos to focus on concrete details. What exactly are we talking about, Hershey, in specific terms?
Hershey pulled out a single sheet of paper that carried the distinctive letterhead of a major accounting firm. Current private valuation of Meridian Technologies, $12.3 billion. My personal stake, approximately $8.7 billion. The number landed in the room like a physical force. Montgomery watched family members process figures that redefined everything they thought they understood about wealth, success, and family hierarchy. James made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a groan. Victoria's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, as if the revelation had made it difficult to breathe. $8 billion, Eleanor repeated slowly, her voice carrying the kind of awe reserved for natural disasters and acts of divine intervention. You're worth $8 billion? Give or take a few $100 million, depending on market fluctuations. Hershey's casual tone made the fortune sound like pocket change, which is roughly 3 times the value of the entire family trust that voted to exclude me yesterday. Catherine stood abruptly, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of implications she couldn't control or manipulate. This is impossible. You've been living like someone struggling to make rent. I've been living like someone who valued independence over family approval, someone who learned that being underestimated was more valuable than being understood. Montgomery realized he was witnessing something far more complex than a simple revelation of hidden wealth. This was the systematic exposure of family dynamics that had been built on false assumptions, careful deceptions, and the kind of willful blindness that wealth often encouraged. Sarah Chen and Nicole Chen entered the library with the quiet authority of people who belonged in boardrooms rather than family confrontations. Their presence immediately shifted the room's dynamics, introducing professional competence into what had been an entirely personal drama. These are my business partners, Hershey continued, gesturing toward the 2 women with genuine respect rather than familial obligation. Nicole Chen, our Chief Technology Officer and co-founder. Sarah Chen, our Head of Operations. They've been helping me build Meridian Technologies while you've all been assuming I was failing at everything I touched. Nicole stepped forward with documents that made Montgomery's investigative materials look like amateur research. We've prepared a complete financial disclosure, including corporate structure, intellectual property holdings, and projected revenue streams through our upcoming IPO.
The paper she distributed painted a picture of systematic success that made the family's assumptions about Hershey's capabilities look like elaborate fiction. Patent filings for AI innovations that were reshaping entire industries. Contracts with Fortune 500 companies that relied on Meridian's technology for their competitive advantage. Revenue projections that suggested the company would soon be generating more annual income than most small countries. The irony is almost perfect, Hershey said, watching her family members struggle to process information that challenged every assumption they had made about her capabilities. You voted me out of the trust for financial irresponsibility while I was preparing to take a company public that will make me one of the wealthiest people in the country. James finally found his voice, though it came out cracked and uncertain. Jesus, Hershey, $8 billion. He ran his hands through his hair with movements that suggested someone grappling with a reality too large to comprehend. Do you understand what this means? It means I voted to exclude the most successful member of this family from our trust because I was too conditioned to follow Catherine's lead to think independently. It means I've been an idiot. Catherine had moved to the window, staring out at the Hamptons coastline with the rigid posture of someone whose entire strategic framework had just been demolished. When she finally turned back to the room, her expression had shifted from shock to calculation, the look of someone already working to adapt to changed circumstances. The legal implications, she said, her voice regaining some of its authority edge. Marcus, we need to understand how this affects the trust vote. Can it be reversed? Marcus Williams had been reviewing Hershey's financial documents with the systematic attention of someone who understood that every page represented millions of dollars in potential legal complexity. His discomfort was visible in the way he kept adjusting his glasses, a nervous habit that emerged whenever family dynamics created professional ethical dilemmas. The vote was legally sound based on the information available at the time, but given these new circumstances, he paused, clearly weighing legal obligations against personal judgment. Eleanor, I think we need to discuss whether the trust's original intentions are being served by the current structure. Eleanor had been studying Hershey with the focused attention of someone reassessing everything she thought she knew about her granddaughter. Despite her 76 years, her business instincts remained sharp enough to recognize that the family dynamics had shifted in ways that required immediate strategic thinking. Hershey, I need to understand your intentions. Are you planning to use this revelation to challenge the trust vote, to claim control of family assets? The question hung in the air with the weight of someone asking whether war had been declared. Montgomery realized he was witnessing negotiations that would determine not just financial control, but the future structure of family relationships. Hershey's response came with the measured calm of someone who had already thought through every possible scenario. I don't need to claim control of family assets, grandmother. I have my own. The simple statement carried more devastating implications than any threat could have. She wasn't asking to be reinstated in the family trust. She was demonstrating that the trust's exclusion had become irrelevant to her actual financial position. Victoria had been processing the revelation with visible difficulty, her face cycling through emotions that suggested someone whose entire understanding of family hierarchy was collapsing. You're saying you don't want back into the trust? I'm saying the trust vote yesterday was the best thing that could have happened to me. Hershey's smile carried genuine relief rather than vindictive satisfaction. For the first time in my adult life, I don't have to pretend to be less than I am to maintain family peace. Robert Sterling spoke for the first time since the revelation began, his voice carrying the calculating tone of someone who'd spent years reading power dynamics. This changes the entire family financial structure. If Hershey's wealth exceeds the trust value by this magnitude, then perhaps we should be asking what she wants from us rather than what we're willing to give her, Eleanor finished, her sharp mind cutting through emotional chaos to reach practical conclusions. Montgomery watched the family reconfigure itself around new information, each member processing implications that went beyond financial structures to questions of respect, authority, and the fundamental basis of family relationships. Nicole Chen had been observing the family dynamics with the careful attention of someone protecting her business partner's interests. There's something else you should understand, she said, her voice carrying professional authority that commanded attention. Meridian's upcoming IPO will make Hershey's success completely public. This conversation isn't just about family relations, it's about how you want to be positioned when the story becomes international news. The implication was clear. The family's dismissive treatment of their most successful member was about to become a very public case study on how assumptions about success could blind people to reality. The response came with the diplomatic precision of someone who'd spent decades navigating complex negotiations. Hershey, I'd like to speak with you privately about the future of this family and what role, if any, you'd like to play in going forward. The invitation carried the weight of someone offering peace negotiations after realizing they'd been fighting the wrong war entirely. The library felt different once the others had departed, leaving Eleanor and Hershey alone among the first editions and family photographs that chronicled decades of Delacroix achievement. Montgomery had reluctantly accepted Eleanor's diplomatic suggestion that he
continue his interview later, though his journalist's instincts clearly rebelled against missing what promised to be the conversation that would determine the family's future direction. Eleanor moved slowly but deliberately to her favorite reading chair, the leather wingback that had been her command center for family decisions spanning 3 decades. Despite her age, her movements carried the purposeful precision of someone who understood that the next hour would define her legacy as much as any business deal she'd ever negotiated. "Sit with me, child," she said, gesturing toward the chair opposite her own. "Not across the room like a business meeting, but close enough that we can speak honestly about what happens next." Hershey chose her seat carefully, noting how the intimate arrangement forced eye contact and eliminated the formal distance that had characterized most of their family interactions. This wasn't grandmother speaking to granddaughter. This was one business leader addressing another as an equal. "I owe you an apology," Eleanor began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who rarely admitted error. "Not just for yesterday's vote, but for years of failing to see what was happening directly in front of me." "You saw what I showed you," Hershey replied, though her tone carried less resentment than simple statement of fact. "I became very good at managing perceptions." "No, that's not accurate." Eleanor's business instincts drove her toward precise analysis rather than comfortable excuses. "I saw what I expected to see because it was easier than questioning assumptions I'd made about you, about what success looks like, about what this family values, about who deserves respect and authority." She paused, studying the family photographs that surrounded them, images of Delacroix patriarchs who'd built the family fortune through textile manufacturing, real estate development, and the kind of traditional business expansion that had defined American wealth for generations. "Your great-grandfather started with a single textile mill in South Carolina. He built this family's foundation through 12-hour days and the absolute conviction that hard work would be rewarded. I continued that tradition, expanding into real estate and finance through the same principles of dedicated effort and strategic thinking." Hershey waited, recognizing that her grandmother was building towards something more substantial than historical reflection. "What I failed to understand," Eleanor said, "is that the next generation of Delacroix success wouldn't necessarily look like the previous ones. You've built something that surpasses anything this family has ever achieved, and I dismissed it because it didn't fit the patterns I understood." The admission carried the weight of someone acknowledging not just personal failure, but the fundamental limitations of her worldview. Eleanor Delacroix, who had successfully navigated business transformations across multiple decades, had been blindsided by innovation happening within her own family. "The question now," Eleanor continued, "is what we do with this knowledge. You have the financial independence to build whatever life you choose, completely separate from this family's influence or approval. But I'm hoping you'll consider a different possibility." She reached for a letter portfolio that had been waiting on the side table, its contents suggesting preparation rather than spontaneous conversation. When she opened it, Hershey recognized legal documents that carried the distinctive formatting of major corporate restructuring.
I'm proposing a complete reorganization of family assets and authority, Eleanor said, spreading papers that would have made Marcus Williams extremely uncomfortable if he'd seen them without proper legal review. Instead of the trust structure that excluded you, I want to establish a family investment entity with you as the primary decision maker. Hershey studied the documents with growing amazement. Her grandmother hadn't just acknowledged her success, she'd spent considerable time and legal resources developing a framework that would position Hershey at the center of family financial strategy. This would give you controlling authority over traditional family assets while maintaining your independence with Meridian Technologies. Think of it as combining old money stability with new money innovation, under the guidance of someone who actually understands both. The proposal was breathtaking in its scope and implications. Rather than simply reinstating Hershey and the trust, Eleanor was suggesting a complete inversion of family power structures that would acknowledge her granddaughter's superior business judgment while providing resources that could amplify her existing success. What about Catherine? She spent 20 years positioning herself to control family assets. This would essentially eliminate her authority. Catherine's authority was based on my failure to recognize where real business acumen existed within this family. She's skilled at managing existing wealth, but she lacks the vision to create new value. You've demonstrated both capabilities. Hershey found herself genuinely considering the proposal, despite years of maintaining careful independence from family influence. The resources Eleanor was offering wouldn't just provide additional capital, they would create opportunities to expand Meridian's social impact while building bridges between traditional philanthropy and technological innovation. There's something else, Eleanor continued. I'm not just offering you family resources, I'm offering you the chance to define what the Delacroix legacy becomes for future generations, to ensure that this family's wealth serves purposes worthy of the intelligence and creativity you've already demonstrated. The conversation had evolved from apology to strategic partnership, with Eleanor essentially offering to transfer family leadership to someone who'd earned it through achievement rather than inherit it through birth order. I need time to consider this, and I'd need guarantees about operational independence. I won't accept family oversight of Meridian Technologies. You'd have complete autonomy over your existing businesses, Eleanor assured her. This proposal is about combining resources, not creating interference. As they sat in the library where family decisions had been made for decades, both women understood that they were negotiating more than financial arrangements. They were determining whether the Delacroix family could evolve beyond its traditional limitations to embrace a future defined by innovation rather than mere wealth preservation. Eleanor's gambit was clear. Transform family dynamics to match family capabilities, with leadership based on demonstrated success rather than inherited authority. The evening air carried the salt tang of the Atlantic as James found Hershey walking alone through the estate's formal gardens, her silhouette framed against the backdrop of hedge mazes and geometric flower beds that had been maintained with obsessive precision for 3 generations. The manicured landscape felt symbolic somehow. Beautiful, but constrained, shaped by expectations rather than allowed to grow naturally. "I've been looking for you," James said, his voice carrying the uncertain tone of someone approaching a conversation he never learned how to have. "After everything that happened today, I needed to talk to you. Actually talk, not just exchange the careful prelatures we've perfected over the years." Hershey turned to face her brother, noting how the formal garden's lighting cast shadows that made him look older than his 31 years. The confidence that came so naturally to him in business settings seemed to have abandoned him completely, leaving someone who looked genuinely lost. "I'm sorry," he said without preamble, the words carrying the weight of someone who'd been rehearsing them since the revelation in the library. Not just for yesterday's vote, but for years of failing to see who you actually were. James—
No, let me finish, please. His hands moved restlessly, the kind of nervous energy that usually preceded his retreat to the bar. I've been thinking about everything since you revealed Meridian, trying to understand how I could have been so completely blind to what you were building. They walked deeper into the garden, passing fountain installations and topiary arrangements that spoke of wealth dedicated to aesthetic perfection. James's confession came in fragments, as if he were discovering his own thoughts in real time. I knew something was different about your ventures. The way you talked about technology, the connections you seemed to have in Silicon Valley, the confidence you showed when you thought no one was paying attention. But I dismissed all of it because accepting that you were succeeding meant confronting how trapped I felt by everyone's expectations of me. Hershey studied her brother's profile, seeing past the expensive education and careful grooming to someone who'd spent his entire life following paths chosen by other people. Trapped how? Do you know what my life actually looks like? James's laugh held no humor. I wake up every morning and put on suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent to go to a job that was essentially bought for me, managing investments I had no role in creating, making decisions that don't matter because the real work is handled by professionals who understand finance in ways I never will. The admission revealed depths of insecurity that Hershey had never suspected. James had always seemed comfortable with his role as the responsible heir, someone who fit naturally into family expectations without the friction that had defined her own relationship with Delacroix authority. I've been living off family reputation and inherited connections for my entire adult life. And then there's you, actually building something revolutionary, creating value from nothing, proving that intelligence and determination matter more than privilege and expectations. They walked deeper into the garden's center, where a marble fountain depicted some mythological scene of transformation that now seemed painfully appropriate. James sat on the fountain's edge with movements that suggested someone carrying invisible weight. The worst part is that part of me knew. Not the specifics about Meridian, but the general truth that you are capable of much more than any of us acknowledged. And instead of supporting you or asking questions or even just treating you with basic respect, I went along with Catherine's narrative because it was easier than confronting my own inadequacies. Hershey studied her brother's profile, seeing past the expensive education and careful grooming to someone who'd spent his entire life following paths chosen by other people. Trapped how? Do you know what my life actually looks like? James's laugh held no humor. I wake up every morning and put on suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent to go to a job that was essentially bought for me, managing investments I had no role in creating, making decisions that don't matter because the real work is handled by professionals who understand finance in ways I never will. The admission revealed depths of insecurity that Hershey had never suspected. James had always seemed comfortable with his role as the responsible heir, someone who fit naturally into family expectations without the friction that had defined her own relationship with Delacroix authority. I've been living off family reputation and inherited connections for my entire adult life. And then there's you, actually building something revolutionary, creating value from nothing, proving that intelligence and determination matter more than privilege and expectations. They walked deeper into the garden's center, where a marble fountain depicted some mythological scene of transformation that now seemed painfully appropriate. James sat on the fountain's edge with movements that suggested someone carrying invisible weight. The worst part is that part of me knew. Not the specifics about Meridian, but the general truth that you are capable of much more than any of us acknowledged. And instead of supporting you or asking questions or even just treating you with basic respect, I went along with Catherine's narrative because it was easier than confronting my own inadequacies. Hershey joined him by the fountain, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough to avoid crowding someone who was clearly working through years of suppressed self-doubt. James, you're not inadequate. You've just been trying to live someone else's version of your life. Have I? His question carried genuine uncertainty. Because looking at what you've accomplished while I've been playing pretend businessman, I'm not sure I actually know what my own version would look like. The vulnerability in his voice reminded Hershey of conversations they had as children, before family expectations and birth order dynamics had created the careful distance that had defined their adult relationship. She realized that her secret success hadn't just been about hiding from family judgment. It had also protected her from having to witness how those same expectations were damaging James. What would you want to do if family expectations didn't exist?
James was quiet for a long moment, as if the question required accessing thoughts he'd learned to suppress. "I used to write," he said finally, "before business school, before the predetermined career path. I wanted to document stories, not fiction, but real accounts of how economic changes affected actual people's lives." The admission surprised Hershey, revealing interests that had been completely invisible during their adult interactions. What kind of stories? The human cost of corporate decisions, how factory closures destroyed communities, how gentrification displaced families who'd lived in neighborhoods for generations, how financial policies created or eliminated opportunities for people who had no voice in the decisions that shaped their lives. James's voice gained strength as he spoke, as if rediscovering passion he'd forgotten he possessed. "That's not inadequacy," Hershey said. "That's social consciousness, the kind of perspective that could make real contributions to how business decisions consider human impact." James looked at her with something approaching hope. "Do you really think so, or are you just being kind to your guilt-ridden brother?" "I think you've been so busy trying to be what other people expected that you forgot to discover what you are actually capable of." Hershey's response carried the conviction of someone who'd lived the difference between imposed roles and authentic identity. "And I think Eleanor's offer might create space for you to find out." Her offer? Hershey realized that the private conversation with their grandmother had happened before James could learn about the proposed family restructuring. "She wants to reorganize family assets with me in a leadership role, which would mean rethinking everyone's responsibilities, including yours." James absorbed this information with the focused attention of someone whose entire future was suddenly being redefined. What would that mean for me? It would mean the chance to use family resources for the kind of social documentation work you just described without the pretense of traditional business management that it's never fit who you actually are. For the first time since the revelation, James's expression showed something other than guilt and self-recrimination. "You'd support that? Even after how I voted yesterday?" "Especially because of how you voted yesterday. Because it showed me that you're capable of growth, of recognizing mistakes and wanting to do better." The evening air carried the salt tang of the Atlantic as James found Hershey walking alone through the estate's formal gardens, her silhouette framed against the backdrop of hedge mazes and geometric flower beds that had been maintained with obsessive precision for 3 generations. The manicured landscape felt symbolic somehow, beautiful but constrained, shaped by expectations rather than allowed to grow naturally. "I've been looking for you," James said, his voice carrying the uncertain tone of someone approaching a conversation he'd never learned how to have. "After everything that happened today, I needed to talk to you. Actually talk, not just exchange the careful pleasantries we've perfected over the years." Hershey turned to face her brother, noting how the formal garden's lighting cast shadows that made him look older than his 31 years. The confidence that came so naturally to him in business settings seemed to have abandoned him completely, leaving someone who looked genuinely lost. They walked deeper into the garden, passing fountain installations and topiary arrangements that spoke of wealth dedicated to aesthetic perfection. James's confession came in fragments, as if he were discovering his own thoughts in real time. "I knew something was different about your ventures. The way you talked about technology, the connections you seemed to have in Silicon Valley, the confidence you showed when you thought no one was paying attention. But I dismissed all of it because accepting that you were succeeding meant confronting how trapped I felt by everyone's expectations of me." Hershey studied her brother's profile, seeing past the expensive education and careful grooming to someone who'd spent his entire life following paths chosen by other people. Trapped how?
Hershey studied her brother's profile, seeing past the expensive education and careful grooming to someone who'd spent his entire life following paths chosen by other people. Trapped how? "Do you know what my life actually looks like?" James's laugh held no humor. "I wake up every morning and put on suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent to go to a job that was essentially bought for me, managing investments I had no role in creating, making decisions that don't matter because the real work is handled by professionals who understand finance in ways I never will." The admission revealed depths of insecurity that Hershey had never suspected. James had always seemed comfortable with his role as the responsible heir, someone who fit naturally into family expectations without the friction that had defined her own relationship with Delacroix authority. I've been living off family reputation and inherited connections for my entire adult life, James continued. And then there's you, actually building something revolutionary, creating value from nothing, proving that intelligence and determination matter more than privilege and expectations. They reached the garden's center, where a marble fountain depicted some mythological scene of transformation that now seemed painfully appropriate. James sat on the fountain's edge with movements that suggested someone carrying invisible weight. The worst part is that part of me knew. Not the specifics about Meridian, but the general truth that you were capable of much more than any of us acknowledged. And instead of supporting you or asking questions or even just treating you with basic respect, I went along with Catherine's narrative because it was easier than confronting my own inadequacies. Hershey joined him by the fountain, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough to avoid crowning someone who was clearly working through years of suppressed self-doubt. James, you're not inadequate. You've just been trying to live someone else's version of your life. The admission surprised Hershey, revealing interests that had been completely invisible during their adult interactions. What kind of stories? The human cost of corporate decisions, how factory closures destroyed communities, how gentrification displaced families who'd lived in neighborhoods for generations, how financial policies created or eliminated opportunities for people who had no voice in the decisions that shaped their lives. James's voice gained strength as he spoke, as if rediscovering passion he'd forgotten he possessed. That's not inadequacy, Hershey said. That's social consciousness, the kind of perspective that could make real contributions to how business decisions consider human impact. James looked at her with something approaching hope. Do you really think so? Or are you just being kind to your guilt-ridden brother? I think you've been so busy trying to be what other people expected that you forgot to discover what you were actually capable of. Hershey's response carried the conviction of someone who'd lived the difference between imposed roles and authentic identity. And I think Eleanor's offer might create space for you to find out. Her offer? Hershey realized that the private conversation with their grandmother had happened before James could learn about the proposed family restructuring. She wants to reorganize family assets with me in a leadership role, which would mean rethinking everyone's responsibilities, including yours. James absorbed this information with the focused attention of someone whose entire future was suddenly being redefined. What would that mean for me? It would mean the chance to use family resources for the kind of social documentation work you just described without the pretense of traditional business management that's never fit who you actually are. For the first time since the revelation, James's expression showed something other than guilt and self-recrimination. You'd support that, even after how I voted yesterday? Especially because of how you voted yesterday. Because it showed me that you're capable of growth, of recognizing mistakes and wanting to do better.
Hadn't been immediate or comfortable, but it had proven that even deeply entrenched family dynamics could evolve when circumstances demanded adaptation. James entered the library carrying documents that reflected his own transformation, from reluctant heir to committed social advocate. His role as Director of Impact Documentation had allowed him to combine his suppressed interest in journalism with the family's expanded philanthropic mission, creating detailed reports on how their investments affected actual communities, rather than just financial markets. The Detroit Urban Renewal Project is generating the kind of results we hoped for, he said, spreading photographs and demographic analyses across the table. Employment in the target neighborhoods has increased by 47%, small business formation is up 62%, and educational outcomes are showing statistically significant improvement. His work had revealed a passion and competence that had been invisible during his years of performing traditional business responsibilities. Instead of managing inherited wealth with dutiful resignation, he was documenting how strategic investment could address systemic social problems while generating sustainable returns.
More importantly, James continued, the community ownership model we developed is being replicated in Cleveland and Baltimore. We're not just improving isolated neighborhoods, we're demonstrating scalable approaches to economic development that other cities can adapt. Victoria had found her own path through the family restructuring, accepting responsibility for coordination between traditional philanthropy and innovative social investment. Her role required the kind of relationship management skills she'd always possessed, but directed toward meaningful outcomes rather than social positioning. The education initiative partnerships are expanding beyond our original targets, she reported. Stanford and MIT have agreed to collaborate on curriculum development for the technology training programs, and we have commitments from 43 companies for guaranteed internship opportunities. Even Robert Sterling had discovered genuine purpose within the restructured family dynamic. His background in investment banking, once deployed primarily for social climbing, now served the family's mission of creating economic opportunities in underserved communities. His analysis of risk and return had proven valuable when applied to ventures that measured success through social impact rather than just financial profit. Marcus Williams, the family attorney who'd been present for both the destructive trust vote and today's constructive planning session, seemed visibly relieved to be handling legal documents that built rather than divided family relationships. All regulatory approvals have been secured for the Delacroix Foundation's expanded charter. You now have legal authority to make direct investments in social enterprises, educational institutions, and community development projects across all 50 states. Sarah Chen, who had witnessed Hershey's journey from hidden entrepreneur to acknowledged family leader, provided operational updates that demonstrated how seamlessly personal success had integrated with family resources. The combined portfolio of Meridian Technologies and Delacroix family assets is now generating enough annual revenue to fund major social initiatives while maintaining all existing family financial commitments. The Mordings business concluded with a document signing that formalized arrangements which had evolved organically over the past 6 months. But as family members prepared to leave for their various responsibilities, Eleanor requested a private moment with Hershey, a conversation that had become their monthly tradition for processing the ongoing transformation of family dynamics. "I've been thinking about your great-grandfather," Eleanor said after the others had departed. "He would have been amazed by what you've accomplished, but not surprised by your success. He always said that the next generation of Delacroix achievement would surpass anything he could imagine." Hershey settled into the chair that had become her customary position for these reflective conversations with her grandmother. "Do you think he would approve of how we're using the family resources?" "I think he would recognize that you understand something he spent his entire life learning, that wealth is only meaningful when it serves purposes larger than personal comfort." Eleanor's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had successfully transferred not just assets, but values to the next generation. "You've taken everything this family built and made it matter in ways we never accomplished." The acknowledgement meant more to Hershey than any financial milestone or business achievement. For most of her life, she'd craved family recognition while simultaneously resenting her need for their approval. The past months had taught her that authentic family relationships were possible when built on mutual respect, rather than inherited obligation. "James told me something interesting yesterday," Eleanor continued. "He said that for the first time in his adult life, he's proud to be a Delacroix, not because of inherited status or accumulated wealth, but because of what this family is actually contributing to the world." Through the library windows, Hershey could see the Atlantic Ocean that had witnessed 3 generations of Delacroix family life. The view remained unchanged, but everything else about their family legacy had been transformed from preservation of inherited privilege to active creation of social value. Her phone buzzed with a text from Nicole. "New AI breakthrough in the lab could revolutionize renewable energy storage. Want to see the preliminary data?"
The message reminded Hershey that her success had never just been about proving herself to family members who'd underestimated her capabilities. The real satisfaction came from building innovations that addressed genuine human needs while creating sustainable value for investors and stakeholders. "I should get back to the city," she told Eleanor. "Meridian has some interesting developments that could accelerate our environmental initiative timeline." Eleanor's smile carried genuine pride rather than the dutiful affection that had once characterized their interactions. "Go change the world, child! This family will be here when you need us, supporting rather than constraining what you choose to build." As Hershey gathered her materials and prepared to return to Manhattan, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from excluded family member to acknowledged leader of a dynasty redefined by purpose rather than just wealth. The transformation hadn't been simple or comfortable, but it had proven that families, like businesses, could evolve beyond their original limitations when guided by vision rather than trapped by tradition. The Delacroix name would continue for future generations, but it would represent innovation and social impact rather than mere accumulation of assets. Children and grandchildren would inherit not just wealth, but the responsibility to use that wealth for meaningful purposes, guided by the example of someone who had transformed family rejection into an opportunity to build something unprecedented. Her rental car pulled away from the estate that had once felt like hostile territory, heading toward the city where her true work continued. Behind her, the Hamptons mansion stood as a monument to old money transformed, still elegant and impressive, but now serving purposes that extended far beyond displaying inherited privilege. The hidden CEO had finally found her rightful place, not by claiming what others had built, but by using her authentic capabilities to create value that surpassed anything previous generations had imagined possible. The inheritance gambit was complete, but the real legacy was just beginning. In her rearview mirror, Hershey watched the estate disappear behind coastal hills, carrying with it the weight of years when she had felt compelled to hide her true capabilities. Ahead lay a future where family resources amplified personal innovation, where inherited wealth served genuine social purpose, and where success was measured not just by financial returns, but by meaningful impact on human flourishing. The Delacroix dynasty had been rebuilt from the inside out, proving that sometimes the most profound changes come not from revolution, but from the patient work of transformation. One authentic relationship, one strategic decision, one purposeful investment at a time.